Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar. Yes, it's a constitutional crisis, understanding the structure of government. And it is a constitutional crisis going on, y'all. Here are a few housekeeping rules. Now, this webinar is being recorded. You can enable closed captioning if you like. Please share your questions in the chat, and you can also raise your hand and we'll take questions at the end of each presenter. We are in meeting mode on Zoom. You can mute and unmute yourself using *6 or the mute button on your phone. And we are in for a real treat today. We have two presenters with us today. Chauncey McGlathery, Director of Public Policy, American Academy of HIV Medicine. He is a phenomenal public speaker, great advocate, and we are just delighted to have him here today. We also have the one and only Martha Cameron, International Community of Women Living with HIV, that's ICW for North America. Also, phenomenal in her field, great public speaker. I call her my mentor as well as my friend. And now we can get a little information about the Positive Women's Network, PWN USA. We are the only national membership body created by and for cisgender and transgender women, gender diverse people, and transgender people living with HIV. Since 2008, our members have created a unified voice and build collective power for women, gender diverse folks, and trans people living with HIV. We believe that racial and gender justice cannot be divested from the HIV response and ground our work in collective liberation. PWN is creating a world where all women, gender diverse, and trans people living with HIV can live long, healthy, and dignified lives free from stigma, discrimination, and criminalization. Okay, now here's a little bit about PWN's Policy Fellowship web series, which this is the first that we are is open to the public. But this is a year-long program designed to support cis and trans women, transgender and gender diverse people living with HIV to build skills and experience in policy advocacy. We are acutely aware that we are launching in the midst of escalating fascism and state terror in the US and abroad. And we're very deliberate about what we're doing now in this moment. Okay, we have structured this year to give participants more tools to respond to new and emerging threats with trusted and emerging strategies. And so, like I said, we're very intentional about what we're doing in this moment with what's going on in this political climate. Goals and objectives. By the time we are finished today, participants will learn about the branches of government and the difference between state and federal advocacy. They'll learn what a constitutional crisis really is, and they'll learn how federal policy shapes state and local policy, using Medicaid cuts as an example. Okay, and here is our agenda for today's webinar. We have welcomed you, and we welcome you once again. So glad you're here. We've had the introduction, structure of government, and that will be by Chauncey McGlathery. And then we'll have time for question and answers. And then we will have Martha to come on and talk about state impacts of federal policy, in specific the Medicaid cuts. And then we will have questions and answers after her segment. As always, we will have a call to action, and we will invite you to connect with PWN. And now, what we've all been waiting for, we have our first speaker. And Chauncey, take it away.
Good evening. Hello. I bring you greetings and salutations from the West Coast. I am in Los Angeles, California. My name, of course, is Chauncey McGlathery. I'm so excited about this conversation. I would love to go on and explain why I'm excited about it, but we are trying to be conscious of time, so I'm going to jump right in. What I would love to do at this moment as we consider the structure of government here in the United States is plant a seed about ruler of law versus rule of law. Think about that as a choice that has been made for our country and the dilemma that we're in. Are we a country where we have a ruler of law, or are we governed by rules of law? Next slide. And so, thinking about policy, I almost suggested that for the sake of today's conversation, we didn't need this slide, but at the end of going through these 4 points, I'm going to explain why I think this is may have been the most critical slide in the entire presentation. So when we talk about policy, and I am the director of policy for the American Academy of HIV Medicine, we're not just talking about laws. We are talking about actions, statements, and proposals, basically anything a government does or aspires to do and how it does it. That's policy. Also, what a government chooses not to do. It can be laws, it can be rules, it can be statements, but it can also be intentions, it could be goals, it could be strategies, it could be ideology. And of course, we know policies affect every aspect of our daily lives. What we also know is that there is tension now between policy and law. And because this particular administration started with a storm, a barrage of executive orders, there's confusion as to what these executive orders mean as it relates to law. It's a very, very clear point that you have to understand. Executive orders are not law. It's critically important. They are policy, which means they indicate how the executive branch has chosen almost like its style of government. But as we will see going through the Constitution, the president does not have the power to unilaterally make law. And it's not an accident. This is not something new. This is the foundation of the country that we live in. There are states in this moment who are choosing, there are institutions in this moment who are choosing to regard executive order as law, but they're doing that because they don't want to fight the good fight and they don't want to expose how we are proceeding in a crisis. But it's not up for debate. Executive order is not law. Next slide. Thank you so much, Kelly. I could go into the whole weeds on this. I will say this. The thing that has disappointed me this year more than anything else is the preemptive bowing to executive orders by institutions, by advocates, by individuals, by universities. It is literally disgusting to me, and it's hard for me to refrain how that feels emotionally. I also need to caveat and say, my opinions in this panel, they're mine. They are not an organizational position. There's no way I could have this conversation within the confounds of any organization because these are all new and in some ways unimagined threats. I won't go into detail here. Use this slide as reference between what's federal, what's state, and local. I'll talk about this a little bit more. The critical difference is the Constitution and our system of government makes really clear what is a federal policy versus what is a state policy. Most of the time, things like criminal law, things like the ability to drive a car, to get married, there are certain aspects of power that are reserved. We call them reserved for states. And then most of the remaining powers are federal by design. And hopefully I can talk about this a little bit more. Before we go to the next slide, on this point, I'll just say we don't decide arbitrarily how power is divided in the United States. It was decided by our Constitution. The answer to the question, ruler of law versus rule of law, that was decided by the Revolutionary War. These are not conversations that are open for debate. Sometimes when you think of power in the United States, the first person you think of is the president. But in fact, the Constitution does not start with presidential power, and it does so by design. It starts with legislative power. In some countries, in some ways of government, the head of state is more ceremonial, and it's the person, it's the face on government, but it isn't. The president doesn't have primary power. And the last thing I'll say on this point, the other point that came out of the American Revolution, which led to the Constitution, which gives us our rule of law, is the idea of no taxation without representation. That needs to be called out in this conversation because it has kind of become a mantra and a theme that defines our country. And it also is a successful strategy in this particular moment, whether we're talking about tariffs or anything else. The foundation of our country is that we do not allow ourselves to be taxed without representation. Next slide. Branches of government. So here again, I think it's important to note initially that the Constitution divides power very much in contrast to the British Empire, which we are largely derived from. We do not centralize power in one branch. We separate it between three branches, and this is the correct order. Legislative is first. Legislative makes laws. Executive branch is second. The executive branch carries out or enforces law. And then the judicial interprets the laws. This should be pretty easy and obvious, but I think it bears mentioning. We don't decide this on a daily basis. This comes from our Constitution. Next slide. Okay, and so it's important that we understand that our legislative branch did not take its form accidentally. In order for the Constitution to become our governing document, once those who were sent to the Constitutional Convention came up with the document, it then had to be ratified by states. And one of the things that was really important is that we didn't create a federal government that was so strong that it resembled a monarchy. And what we decided to do was put the weight of our power in the legislative branch. And we divided it the way that we did so that a state doesn't get outvoted just because it's smaller or larger than another state. So we have two different, or it's called bicameral, two sides to our legislative branch. And it's designed this way on purpose. I think that's probably enough on that. Next slide. So, executive branch. Of course, we know that the executive branch starts with the president. The president is by design to surround him or herself with advisors, cabinet positions, department heads, who are subject matter experts in their respective areas. It was never envisioned that the president would be so experienced or so smart or so knowledgeable to know all of the intricate details around all the different departments like health or energy or defense. And so the design is that there would be an appointment of department heads who are experts. Of course, part of our crisis comes here. It appears that instead of surrounding themselves with cabinet positions of people who have subject matter expert, it seems like it's almost a reward for being friendly or favorable or being ideologically compatible. And so instead of having subject matter experts, you have friends. You have allies, you have partners, and sometimes these people have personal or corporate interests that directly conflict with the interests of our government. Um, and of course, part of our separation of powers allows those heads of departments to be carefully scrutinized and voted on by the Senate. So it's important that we kind of celebrate those checks and balances even at this point. Staff members and advisors, independent establishment corporations. I'll just say on this, one of the other disappointing things of the moment that we're in is the attack on the independence of some of our agencies and the institutions that largely keep us apprised of what's going on with those agencies. There's so many advisory boards that are part of this executive branch that have been dismantled, so many that have been called into question, so that it almost seems that our government is changing in form to being almost a monarchy de facto, a monarchy in practice, even though we're in the middle of a constitutional republic. Again, it's also really important and critical here that we talk about how important it is that all of our institutions toe the line and know their responsibilities in government, so that when those responsibilities are threatened, whether by executive order, whether by phone call, email, chat, however the information gets to you, everyone's supposed to know exactly what to do. And part of the attack here that got launched in Project 25 was against federal workers, which is incredibly important. There are 4 million people, I should mention, 4 million people in the executive branch. And so part of what the strategy has been is to reduce the number of people in the branch, not because it's inefficient or overly bureaucratic, which is what you will hear the company line is, but because these people actually are subject matter experts and have been in their respective offices and fields for decades, sometimes a couple of generations, right? And so they know how government should function. But the idea is that they provide a balance, a check, and don't allow crazy things to happen without being accounted for. And so the plan originally was to get rid of any who would not be loyal to the president, which again is screaming of a monarchy, which by our Revolutionary War, we've decidedly that we're clear that this is not what we want, but we're kind of emerging to this place through a back door. I think that's enough on that. Next slide. So the hero of the day, the hero of the moment, the hero of the hour is not the legislative branch, which it always was designed to be. That's why Article 1 of the Constitution starts with the legislative branch and not the president. The hero of this moment, and I'm using this term very loosely, is the judicial branch. Were it not for the judicial branch, we would be in a very different position than we are now. The judicial branch, and this is, of course, we're talking about the federal court system. We're talking about the Supreme Court, which everyone is familiar with, the courts of appeals, and the district courts. So just like in a state system, there are levels of courts. This is an area, especially for me. When I went to law school, I specialized in constitutional law, which is, of course, the background for all of this. And my job was federal litigation. And so I was in a unique position to be able to have oversight over state actions. The civil rights movement would have never happened in America without the federal court system, because the federal court system had power to scrutinize state action. And to the extent that a state did something that was unconstitutional, and when I say unconstitutional, I'm talking about the US Constitution, the federal government can step in and bring things back. So you start on the district court level, and then several district courts comprise a region. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals is the one that we talk a lot about now. And then, of course, above that is the Supreme Court. As we may not get a chance to know, if you lose a big point, as we did with RFRA and Braidwood, if we lose a question at the district court, it's a strategic decision whether or not you're going to take it to the next level. Because if you lose, we would call that bad law or unfavorable outcome. If you take it up on appeal and lose again, then it's not just the law of the district, it becomes the law of the region, which means several states now are under the particular case. So since we lost religious freedom, preventive care under religious freedom at the district court level, we did not take that to the next level because we were afraid in this climate that we would lose it there. And so that's why when the Braidwood decision comes out tomorrow, it will not refer to the Religious Freedom Act as it did at the district court, because we decided not to appeal that in order to not create bad federal law, so that whatever the decision on religious freedom would not become the indisputable law of the land. I know that may have been more than we needed to talk about at a particular moment, but Braidwood is on my mind, and I'm excited about Braidwood, even if we lose. Braidwood is an opportunity. I don't know if I'll get a chance to talk about that more. Next slide, please. Separation of powers. I've kind of gone into this already, but this is just a kind of a breakdown on how every branch has checks and balances on every other branch. The executive branch is checked by the legislative branch in oversight, checked by the judicial branch in interpretation. The legislative branch is checked by the executive branch by veto power and tiebreaker in the Senate, and checked by the judicial branch in interpreting laws. And then the judicial authority is checked by executive branch by appointment of judges, the legislative branch by approval of appointments and power of impeachment of judges. Next slide. Okay, great. I'm glad we got here, because I'm like, there's three things that I wanted to have time to say. How we got to this constitutional crisis. I was thinking about this today. It's three parts from my vantage point. First, it's 2010, Citizens United. The Citizens United case allowed corporations to function as persons. The case granted corporations what they called personhood, and in the process allowed them to donate money toward campaigns without traditional accounting, reporting, and safeguards. That is part of the perfect storm. The second thing that happened is 2016, when Merrick Garland was not allowed to be even considered for a Supreme Court position. That's the second piece. And then the third piece is 2024, when the Supreme Court granted Donald Trump presidential immunity and basically said, regardless of what he does, he can't be prosecuted. And they gave absolute immunity if he's acting within his constitutional authority, but then they gave limited immunity even if he's acting outside of it. And then they gave some other kind of power to where basically, even if he's outside of that, he still can't be prosecuted. And so those three elements bring us to the point that we're at today. I know there's tons of questions. I went through that extremely fast. These are all passion subjects for me. So there's certain things I was trying to make sure I said, but I could have skipped some things. So I think we're at questions and answers, Myra. And
Yes,
you can
questions.
you can leave that I didn't go to that last graphic about presidents are not kings, but we kind of talked about this already. So this could be the backdrop as we go into questions and answers. I love sometimes illustrations are better than words.
Okay, we have some questions in the chat, and I love the illustrations. Okay, this comes from, who is this? CNET? Which branch of the government ensures that the Supreme Court rulings are enforced? Did you cover that? Of late, the government has been defying Supreme Court rulings with impunity, especially on immigration and ICE issues.
Yeah, so this is great. Again, remember those 3 points that I just gave you about how we got here? First of all, and when I say we, I'm talking about the framers of the Constitution, the framers of our government. It was never imagined that someone with the level of intelligence and incompetence, with the level of fragile ego, audacity, disrespect, it was never imagined that a person like that could ever ascend to any major public office in this country, any at all, including dog catcher. So part of the first problem is we did not and do not have safeguards to ensure that the persons running for the highest office in the land are not convicted of 34 felonies before they get on the ballot. It's not in the Constitution because it was never imagined that it could happen. And so that's a first very important piece. The second piece is because of the Supreme Court's opinion in Trump versus United States, I think it may have been whatever the 2024 case that I just referred to, they basically have said that there is no one who really can force the president to do anything. That was a choice. So there really is no constitutional safeguard to protect the republic from the president, with the exception of the 25th Amendment, which basically says if at some point the president cannot or somehow is unable to function, then they could be impeached or removed because of their inability to function in their office. But we're not in a world where that would ever happen. But that would be the only check of presidential authority in this moment, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Wow. And that kind of leads us into the next question from Kate Elling. The Constitution was written so long ago. Can it be rewritten?
Yes. Well, I said that too fast. The Constitution can be amended. So you got to, and this is why I'm glad we got a chance to talk about this initially. The whole 1783 strategy was to create a constitutional convention where the Constitution was created. And then after it was created, it had to be ratified by the states, 2/3, 3/4, I can't remember which. So there is a process to amend the Constitution, but that's really the language that we would be talking about. We would be amending it. And it's very, 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 very difficult, if not near impossible, to get a new constitutional amendment. It happens like with a regularity of seeing Halley's Comet, which is every 75 years. Our country, and the more divisive, the more polarized, the more partisan we become, the less likely that will happen. Theoretically, it could happen, but it's just, thank you, 2/3. It's not going to happen anytime soon.
Okay. Excellent. Next question from Susan. Susan Moe. Are the boards that are appointed or boards that exist and experts sit on these boards like Pacha? Is a president always allowed to dismantle them? And
Such a great and timely question. I love when
does
this
Pacha
happens.
still exist? Yes.
So Pacha does still exist. We've been talking about this in DC all week. Pacha does still exist, but Pacha is not meeting. It is not convening. And that's pretty much consistent with the whole, like I said, this Project 25 vision of reducing the size of government so that it can ebb and flow at will. And this is part of that ruler versus rule of law. What was the beginning of that question before Pacha? Does Pacha exist? What's the first thing you asked me?
The first part of the question, are boards that are appointed or boards that exist and experts sit on these boards like Pacha, is the president allowed to dismantle them? Is he allowed to do that?
Yeah, and so this is Braidwood. This is exactly where we are with Braidwood, and we're going to find out a big answer to this question tomorrow. I'll just say shortly, the reason why the government changed its position on Braidwood is because they want the Secretary of of Health to have oversight over the task force, the USPSTF, right? And so that's why the whole idea is to give the president, through the secretary, the authority to challenge the decisions. And also these questions were asked of the Supreme Court to, if they don't like who's on it or the decisions that they have are coming up with, they can remove them at will. And so part of what was just established in Braidwood, at least as it relates to this particular issue, is that their secretary does have authority to have oversight over decisions, and presumably, we'll find out tomorrow, remove anyone, including everyone, on any advisory, by extension, any advisory group, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay. We have a question from Susan. What is an example of...
Myra, sorry,
Yes.
Nikisa's hand is up. I just wanted to point that
Oh,
out.
okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, Nikisa? You're on mute.
Sorry, I was coming. I couldn't
There
find
you
me.
go. I'm sorry about that. I didn't see
Sorry.
you.
So it's okay. I just went up. So good evening. This is really good. I have you answered one of my questions, but I got a couple more. One question is about going back to amendments. When was the last time we had an amendment to the Constitution? And then also, I took political science before. So could you go over because I know you said you talked about like we couldn't imagine that we got this kind of president or whatever. But could you go over the qualifications? Like I think I remember them, but I think it'll be just good to like know like what qualifies somebody to be president, because I don't remember it being a lot of things.
It's not a
So
lot
if you
of
could talk
things.
about that. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, and on that second question, it may be a good idea for us, and I'm going to look to see if I have it in my notes to because it's like 3 or 4 things. It's like literally, you have to be of a certain age. I think you have to be born in the United States, and like one other thing. So I'm going to look and see if I can find it quickly. But if not, that's something that we can share out after the webinar. But as it relates to the last amendment, I did find that. That's the 27th Amendment. It was ratified in 92. And it basically says that any law that changes the compensation of members of Congress cannot take effect until after the next election of representatives. So that is interesting to me, that the last amendment was about how much money the representatives make. I think there's just incredible irony there. I just kind of leave it for you to think about that.
Can I also just add in here, and Chauncey, I want to hear if you have any like reflections on this, but also we have amendments like the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have just guaranteed equal rights for all citizens regardless of sex, which still hasn't passed, right? It was first proposed in 1923, and they still have not been able to get that amendment through the Constitution, just kind of showing how hard it is and how deeply sex discrimination is built into our systems of governance.
I'm going to see your Equal Rights Amendment, and I'm going to raise you. Slavery is not unconstitutional according to our according to the United States Constitution. I am not fully human. I am 3/5 at this moment in 2025, right? So, and this is why the role of the judiciary is so critically important. Because if it weren't for the judiciary to interpret the rules and say, oh my God, I can't even believe you're in front of me asking this question, which is what would happen if that claim were ever made in a court, right? You have to have a group to interpret and say, surely. That's where almost all of our First Amendment rights, right to privacy, freedom of speech, assembly, these aren't, you won't be able to find them in the text, but a lot of these things have been interpreted. So, surely the framers must have intended. Actually, they didn't. but the judiciary kind of saves you from yourself. Which is why the constitutional makeup, the makeup of the Supreme Court is so critically important, because they can bail you out when you have a Congress or you have an executive who can't make common sense decisions. Oh, and I did find the qualifications of the President of the United States. The individual must be a natural born citizen, be at least 35 years old, and have been a resident of the United States for 14 years. That's all you have to do. So one of our call to actions at the end is deciding who on this call is going to run for president in the next election, because we all, 90% of us qualify.
You.
Don't even, no, you don't even understand how many times someone has said that to me, and I have thought about it many times. I think we have another question.
Yes, Kate. You can unmute.
Yeah, hi. Hi. Chauncey, I just have a follow-up question on the Constitution. If you get enough people fighting to make some changes in it, is it at all possible? The Constitution and the laws surrounding our government were written so long ago that they didn't expect situations like this, where now we have somebody with felonies as our president.
And so can you say the first part of your conversation again? If you get enough people, then did you say at the beginning, if you get enough people to support an idea, can you then change the Constitution? Is that what your first part of the question was?
Yeah. At that point, can we make a amendments to the Constitution if we get enough people willing to stand and try and make that happen?
Okay, so theoretically, the answer should be yes. However, we do not have a direct democracy. And that's one reason why we call ourselves a republic. We have a representative democracy where we vote for people who then make decisions on our behalf, right? That's what the Electoral College is all about. Okay. And so the opportunity that we as a collective get to weigh in is through the electoral process, which is why voting, registering to vote, being an informed citizenry are so critically important. But because of the corrupting factors in human nature and in our world, our representative democracy falls far short of the will of the people. But in moments like what's going on with the budget process and reconciliation, all these things, it does matter what the public thinks, because at a certain point, if a poll or public opinion becomes something that is not in debate, people who are running for office will be so terrified to do the thing, even if it benefits them personally, they won't risk it. The second part of that is, once they do something against your interest, you have to hold them accountable so that they are not able to politically survive and never run for any office again once they betrayed your trust. Our country has not really figured out a mechanism, and I think technology probably can in this moment, if we put our brains together and think about it. We've got to figure out a way to tie the decisions or indecisions around the necks of the representatives, so they can't run from it, they can't hide from it. It will follow them to the end of the earth. We haven't figured out how to do that now. And most of our memory, we have amnesia. By the next news cycle, we don't even remember how our representative responded, and that has to stop.
Yeah. Also with the blocking of our media in this presidency that's been going on, that makes it even harder to try and hold people accountable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But we don't really have a rule that prevents the administration from acting that way. That's a privilege. We call that almost a presidential privilege to decide who's in the briefing rooms.
So what can I do as an individual to try and get Trump out of the presidency? Is there anything that he's doing that can be cause for impeachment?
Absolutely. And you're kind of in our last segment, our call to action that's going to come at the end of our panel. But hold that question. If you're not satisfied with what we land on, then ask it again.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
And I just want to acknowledge something that Zena wrote in the chat really quick. I personally think that the way the current admin's deportation is happening and sending people to faces they're not from, and I will add disappearing people without any due process, is paving the way for the government to act outside of existing law, legal or illegal, according to the Constitution. And I think this returns us to where we started with the constitutional crisis. So Chauncey, I just wanted to see if you had any reflections from that before I know Myra's gonna move us on.
Yeah, it's so. World War II is probably the best historical reference for the moment that we're in. And the tactic is, let's try and let's do the most ridiculous thing that we can think of. Let's find a group that we can get away with it. And once we get away with it with this group, we'll move it to the next group. I feel like that what the administration actually wants to do is deport anyone who doesn't support their policies. It actually doesn't have anything to do with citizenship. It's just that the citizenship issue becomes the least, the path of least resistance. And what we have to do in this moment is not allow ourselves to be divided and not picked off one by one, and which is what is happening on so many different ways. We have, in this moment, failed many of the tests and allowed a particular issue to say, oh, well, that doesn't actually affect me. Oh, well, it doesn't matter if there's zero cost sharing. I can afford my preventive care, right? We excuse ourselves. We exempt ourselves from the crisis because it doesn't come to our doorstep. What we've learned throughout history is if the crisis affects anyone, it should affect you, right? That freedom only exists if everybody has it. If there's ever any group of people that don't have it, we don't have it. And that's, again, that's a kind of we the people philosophy that was talked about a lot initially, but I think we've gotten away from it now because we think more about the individual than the collective.
Okay. Well, we thank you so much for that, Chauncey. Very informative. Let's give Chauncey a round of applause or some thumbs up or celebrate him for being here with us today. Because I really learned a lot from that segment. That was great. Great. Okay. And now moving right along, let's go to Martha Cameron. Uh, State impact from federal policies. And she's particularly going to be talking about Medicaid cuts. Okay, so Martha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I was so like just enthralled by this conversation. And I don't know if folks know, I was a policy fellow too at some point, and it is where I got my first comprehensive education about the government. See, I'm an immigrant, so I'd never been to school here. I did not know about Article 1 of the Constitution that talks about the separation of powers. And case in point, I came from a different form of government that Chauncey like briefly mentioned, where we have a parliament. So my country was a British colony, and we have a parliament, which, it's really a government by the people. And that's where things like, what I put in the chat can happen, where an overthrow can happen. But the way we're heading now, I just don't think anything is off the table. I think when people get angry enough and band together enough, I think, you can make some changes. So state impact from the federal policies. And we're going to zero in on the Medicaid cuts. So next slide. So we learned a lot from what Chauncey was saying about how the government functions. It's supposed to function in partnership with the state, right? The legislative branch is who makes and implements, some of the activities that are going on. And this, in cases of health, is done in partnership with the federal government. So we didn't get into it. I think Chauncey didn't get into the weeds of the budget that has been done by this current president, based on, the campaign promises that they had. And based on, somebody asked about boards. We have sort of this entity called DOJ that is making these cuts to the federal government, and in a bid to save money. And yet they have literally turned around and still adding not only more debt, but maintaining tax cuts, and other incentives for billionaires, right? But one of the ways that they are saying, quote unquote, they can save money they from this government is by cutting Medicaid. We knew this all along. They tried to deny it, but we knew that it had been laid out. I always give the example of, how as you go older and you're trying to date or partner up with someone, you start to see these flags very early on. The older you get, the sooner you get to see the flags. Sometimes we don't walk away from them, sometimes we do. But in this case, the government came with a truckload of flags and literally dumped them right in front of us in a document called Project 2025. We knew what they were going to do to the Department of Education. We knew that there was no way they could save money from this budget without cutting Medicaid. And so we know it's on the chopping board. You guys have been hearing about it, but we're going to zoom in on it. How does it work? Medicaid is funded by both the federal government and the states. They have matching funds because it's a responsibility. Health is a human right. It's a public health, basically obligation of the government, right? To make sure that people have basic health. Here, in the US, it functions very differently from other places, but what we understand is that it's a partnership. There's matching funds that come from the government, and then the states match it up within. They also have a responsibility to set the minimum standards, right? For what are the basic things that you can get when you have Medicaid. When we transitioned to the ACA, we had these sort of 10 essential services that a person is supposed to get. And you find that there are those minimum standards that are set in terms of the basic care that you can get. And then there's also eligibility, right? Before, in some cases, and still in some places, you can only get Medicaid if you're pretty much on your deathbed. But we knew that with the ACA that came in, with expanded Medicaid, a lot more people were able to qualify for Medicaid. And we know that it is also administered with federal guidelines. So all those minimum standards, eligibility, and guidelines are set by the federal government. Um, how does it help people? This is the largest public health program in the US. It has health and long-term care services for people, over 80 million people. I mean, that's a lot of people that could lose coverage in some form or fashion right now. It covers literally 1 in 5. If you can't get around 80 million people, if there's 5 people in your household, we know at least 1 or 2 or 3 of them have Medicaid, 1 in 5 people. And it accounts for almost a fifth of all healthcare and hospital spending, especially in rural areas, right? In some of these places, Medicaid is what helps a lot of people. It helps people. And then for people living with HIV, it says 40% here, but I know that almost half the people living with HIV are covered in some form or fashion by Medicaid. And I think here it's saying 40% of non-elderly people, meaning young people, are also covered. Because remember, there's Medicaid and then there's Medicare for people that are over 65. It is also the largest healthcare provider for racial, gender, reproductive, and disabled minorities, essentially, the most vulnerable. This is what covers. And it absolutely improves health and outcomes and prevents medical debt. So if you can't take care of basic preventative services, you cannot have primary health care. The health outcomes that are going to come on the other side of that are going to be more costly. And we know that Medicaid prevents all of this. So it's a really, really important. And what has been great to understand in the environment that we're in now is that we know it's not just impacting people living with HIV. We know that it's impacting those that are vulnerable, those that have low income, those that have disabilities, and it doesn't matter. There's white people, black people, everybody is impacted by this because there's states where we know that we have the working poor, where we have people who are really, really essentially the victims of a system of an oppressive government, right? It doesn't allow you to succeed for all manner of reasons, including racial and gender injustices. But we know that it's a safety net. Medicaid is a safety net for everybody. Next slide. Yeah, so what has happened here? And there's been so much that has been happening from January 20th, right? We can't keep up. There's been executive orders that have changed so many things and really targeted, folks. But this is how many months later? It feels like 3 years. This is 5, 6 months later, and uh, basically the Republicans are pulling a reverse Robin Hood. And what does this mean? This big, beautiful bill that the Senate is trying to move literally by the end of this week. We've had crisis in the Middle East. We bombed the country without, Chauncey was talking about how there's this balance of power and, people are supposed to make decisions. Nope, nobody was consulted. We bombed a country. There's other things going on. And basically, the Republicans have been given 1 week before 4th of July to pass this bill. And, we can explain this in so many ways and, talk about the math. But I think what we need to understand and the language that we need to have is that this bill is basically funding billionaires, right? Large tax breaks that had gone in before are being expanded. And then if you look at the details on where if 55, look at the math there, has this kind of annual income, you're spending it on health insurance, you're trying to buy food, you're trying to pay bills, you have nothing. And meanwhile, these billionaires are getting money. Who was the head of Doge? He was a millionaire who, with conflicting interest in terms of the amount of money that he gets from the government to send rockets into the sky while people are dying, right? But I got the popcorn when the fight started, when the breakup started, because all of a sudden this guy is saying, oh, how come we are now getting 4 more trillion in dollars when we're supposed to, quote unquote, have been saving money? And those dollars are just going to be funding these tax cuts for the billionaires. If you can't walk away with anything at all about this budget, is just understanding how it is meant to give breaks to billionaires. Next slide. So what will this bill do? I think we've already mentioned it. It would be the largest Medicaid cuts in history. I mean, we're talking 90 billion, I think. I don't know if it's over there, but it strips roughly 16 million people of healthcare. And then it puts a lot more people, 7 million, at the risk of losing food stamps and SNAP. Obviously, we know that it is funding the anti-immigrant agenda that is happening to just in shocking ways. We know that it is full of anti-trans rhetoric. Today, I heard about how, the Make America Healthy Again, part of the research, they've been cutting all this research, and they're funding a specific research that is literally related to finding trans folks that are, I can't remember what the wording was, but literally, the question that was being asked about the research that they're funding is it science, or is it meant to just put a fire under their agenda? And that's what this is. We know it's anti-trans, we know it's anti-immigrant, we know it's anti-sexual and reproductive health, we know it's anti-abortion. I was actually telling Kelly just before the call, I said, did you hear about what happened in South Carolina, where they have essentially upheld a law that will defund medical services, not even anti-abortion, just other services that Planned Parenthood has provided in South Carolina. We know that this fascist regime wants to put billions to fund all this stuff that is going on, the detentions, the deportation, and just disappearing people, just disappearing. Like, I don't understand how people don't see what a vendetta this is. And I talk to folks. I live in a very conservative area, and I try to find out how people are feeling. And you can say, oh yeah, well, we did want him to deport criminals, but we didn't know that he would be deporting people who are just going through legal immigration processes. They have fled to this country, they have applied for asylum, they're working, and they're being sent to deportation centers and sent out. So this is a coordinated assault on rights, on health, on safety, with the most of us being impacted. The communities that are impacted by HIV are reflected in the people that are most impacted by what is going on. Okay, if you can go back just a little, I just wanted to say one more thing. Just go back to the other slide about 5 ways that it has there. One of the things that they've been talking about is this work eligibility. No, the slide that you're on, you're fine. Work eligibility requirements, where they're saying they want people to be working in order to get Medicaid, and yet you can barely because of the oppressive systems that we have, you can barely make ends meet before you have to spend on insurance the way that, I mean, this is basically daylight robbery. But anyway, I wanted to mention work requirements because there's I've been part of an effort, an organization that, works around people living with HIV and employment. And we know that one of the biggest barriers is this idea to insurance and better healthcare is this idea of work eligibility. Next slide. This will impact everyone, right? The Medicaid sides will impact everyone, especially people of color, especially Black people, especially if we look along gender lines where we know trans folks are being attacked, gender affirming care is being stopped, all this stuff that is going on, right? We know that this will lead to increased medical debt and bankruptcy. We know that there is already structural violence against our people. We've been planning for the big USCHA conference, and even when we've done all these other conferences that have happened, we have been planning for extra security because of real, not just structural violence, but even physical violence against our people. We know that, like I mentioned before, there'll be hospital closures in rural hospitals, and we know that they'll be restricted. I mean, this has already happened, right? Where if the federal government, doesn't give their portion of the money to the states, then the states will be overburdened, and it will impact all these other healthcare systems, including Ryan White, and so on and so forth. And somebody asked, Chauncey, I know we were saving this sort of for the last portion. Somebody asked, what can we do? We've got a few days to keep talking about this, to keep calling our senators, especially in states where Republican officials were voted in, and we know that they cannot afford to cut Medicaid, especially in some of these red and rural areas. We need to keep calling and calling and calling and making sure that they know that this is unacceptable. Next slide. Okay, so there's a bit of a timeline here that we understand that the House has already voted and passed this big, beautiful bill. The Senate has to vote before in literally 4 days, and then they're supposed to go on recess. My understanding, and Kelly, I might tag team with you here, they're trying to pass this before the recess. And so then around June 30th, it will likely go back to the House. And then in August, we'll be hitting our debt ceiling where they'll have to increase this. Kelly, did you want to say a little bit more about this timeline?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's passed the House and now it's in the Senate. Because they are moving really fast and oftentimes in the dead of night to try to pass this bill. There was an example where my partner and I stayed up until 1 a.m. to hear a committee hearing where they were talking about changes to this bill. And that is a strategy, right? It is so wildly unpopular to steal from poor and working class communities in order to give billionaires more tax breaks and to fuel this cruel and inhumane immigration disappearance machine that the Trump administration has going, that they have to move this bill as quickly as possible, right? That is why they're trying to get it through the Senate before recess on June 30th. And then the thought is the rumors that we're hearing, because a lot of this is based on rumors, is that once it passes the Senate, they're going to quickly go back to the House. And in fact, Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has suggested that he might hold the House members back from going to recess, so back from taking a break, so that they can vote on this bill. And they have to do it before the US hits the debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling is when basically the US can no longer pay our debts and would trigger like really severe economic impacts, including recession in the US and global impacts. And so in this bill includes a raising of the debt ceiling. And so they actually do have a timeline.
By $4 trillion. Did we lose Kelly? Or am I the one who's lost? All right, I can't
The
hear
enemy
you.
is busy.
Hey, folks, my apologies. Did I lose you?
Yes,
Yes.
just for a second, yeah.
Hey, folks.
Yeah, okay. Are you back?
Hey, folks, my apologies. Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Hello?
Yes,
We
we
can
can hear
hear
you.
you.
I'll just continue.
Oh, okay, good. I am back.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. I might end up.
Kelly, I'll continue, but essentially, we've all heard about this debt ceiling, and
All
we
right.
know.
Okay, can you
Okay.
hear us, Kelly? Well, go ahead and continue, Martha.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and continue. And, we always hear how whenever they're trying to balance this budget, they talk about raising, or they try not to raise the debt ceiling, or they agree on the budget, but every time it goes up. And they're saying that this bill is likely to raise the debt ceiling by about $4 trillion from what I've heard, which doesn't make any sense. If they were trying to save by using this budget, they were saying they were going to save $2 trillion. And so that math is not mathing, as they say. And then, what we've got to understand about this debt that we have too is how we are putting future generations that are not even born in debt. And we know that the brunt of that is going to be borne by our communities, the communities that continue to suffer from systematic oppression of this entire system, fascist and capitalist system. Next slide.
And I am back. I apologize for that, folks. Terrible time for my internet to go out.
Yeah, I know. And I'm
Yes,
looking at
the
my
enemy is
storms here
busy.
too.
I got to
So
say.
just in case. But yeah, and of course this has been changing every day. And here we are. Today, there has been changes that just don't meet the Senate rules. Now, part of this is that they really understood that especially for some states, this could hurt the Republican Party quite a bit, right? The parliamentarian had ruled against provisions that would change how states can tax Medicaid providers. They would bar the use of Medicaid and CHIP, this is the children's funds, for gender affirming care. And of course, they're restricting Medicaid coverage for immigrants. And this is things that we hadn't even anticipated. And then they will punish the states for using states funds to provide healthcare coverage to folks who are undocumented. So the attack on immigrants continues. But Kelly, did you want to say a little bit more about this?
Yes. And I'm sorry if I'm repeating things. Like I said, my internet went out, unfortunately. So as Martha said, right, the news changes every single day. There has actually been news updates since we drafted these slides. It's so hard to stay on top of it. But one of the things that changed is that someone called the Senate parliamentarian actually ruled to strike some of the provisions that were in the Senate bill, some of the really cruel provisions. So the things like Martha was talking about, restrictions on gender affirming care, restrictions on folks who are immigrants, regardless of documentation status's ability to access the healthcare that they need to survive and thrive.
In this country, yeah.
Yes. And so what this ultimately means is that the parliamentarian has kind of thrown a little bit of a wrench into the Senate's plans to move as quickly as possible. And that's because, as Martha said before, the math isn't mathing. They changed the math once again. And so they're going to have to kind of figure out how to balance out some of the Medicaid cuts that they lost by either making worse Medicaid cuts in other areas, or they're going to have to rewrite the provisions to have a different impact, or they can try to add these amendments back, but it would be really, really hard for them to do so. So I think the too long didn't read, not trying to get into the nitty gritty of the parliamentarian rules. The Senate's at a bit of a sticky point right now, and it gives us the opportunity to keep pushing because it's going to be harder and harder for them to pass the bill as quickly as they want to, which is over the weekend. So we strongly suggest that you keep pushing, keep calling, keep writing, keep mobilizing in your community, form those relationships with folks who are as angry as you, who are working like you, who care about healthcare as a human right, who care about food security as a human right, who care about immigrant justice and healthcare justice. Keep working with them to push against this bill because it's not done yet. And they are going to have to kind of renegotiate a little bit of what's going on.
Yeah. And even if yeah, and absolutely keep calling and keep putting the pressure. But even if, because what is happening, what has happened with different scenarios is that the president will go back in and bully folks, threaten them, and get their votes. That quote by Katanja about the king, this is really how this current president is acting. And so, want to stay in favor, or whatever it is, the reason that is making these folks so dysfunctional, even if this were to go through, as Chauncey said, our power will be at the ballot. That this will give us more fuel to turn this thing around, because it's gonna impact more than just our population, more than just our community of people living with HIV. But yeah, next slide.
Okay, once again, y'all, we are at our questions and comments section. I do see some questions in the chat. First question from C. How will the Medicaid cuts affect quality of life for people living with HIV, especially children born with HIV? And two-part question: should people start taking their meds once a week, as suggested by some
Oh no.
USAID doctors?
Yeah, so
That's
it's
deep.
this second question is actually related to what has been happening in the global South, where like Ryan White, we there is a funding specifically for HIV called PEPFAR, and that was just cut overnight, like pulling a life support. And we know that we will start seeing folks die. I mean, it's as simple as that, right? We will start seeing folks die because there is no other way, especially in some of the poor countries. I mean, it's not uniform across the board, but it's the majority are poor countries, and the majority have relied on this, including myself. I was diagnosed in Africa. I was one of the first recipients of PEPFAR in Africa, and I would not be here had it not been for those funds. When I moved to this country, I could not get Medicaid for 3 years. You have to have lived in this country for 3 years as an immigrant before you can get Medicaid. I was able to access Ryan White as a documented immigrant. This is what we're talking about. Like, this is real for people who are immigrants. But somebody asks a quality of life question here about people living with HIV. This is dire. This is not just about not being able to afford um, anything. The medication that we get keeps us alive. And once you are not able to have access to life-saving medication, it is not even just about quality of life. It is actually life and death that we're talking about here. Because the drugs for HIV are still so expensive. Um, no person, not even middle class people, can afford it, let alone the most part, those people who access Medicaid who live under, federal poverty lines, hand to mouth. Are you going to buy food or are you going to buy your medication? Are you gonna, you're talking about children being born with HIV. Just about 2 weeks ago, I witnessed a young woman, she's about, I would say 21, who was pregnant, had syphilis, had HIV. Didn't even know, and was tested upon pregnancy and was able to get life-saving drugs. Folks, this is a matter of life and death. This is not just an everyday battle. Losing Medicaid for those vulnerable people, when they lose access to medication, they will die. I mean, it's as simple as that. Not that I want to, it's hyperbole or whatever. We will lose access to life-saving medication if we lose Medicaid, because they will have to stretch their dollars. They will have to, that's why they're changing eligibility. It won't be just because you have HIV, it will be because you have all these other things. And we will not be able to afford HIV medications as it stands now. So, folks, please really take this seriously. And when we ask for, ramping up the calls and talking with community members, there are people who have other issues, not just diabetes, autism, all kinds of disabilities that are going to lose access to life-saving medication. And that's why we have to form coalition. We have to band up with anybody who is anybody in our community, because this will impact everybody. We are going to see like things that had happened years and years and years ago in this country before the public health system was what it is today.
Great. Um, we have a question from Denise. How can we lobby the pharmaceutical companies to lower the cost or provide more access to their meds in drug cards, or ways to help us pay for our meds?
So this is already done, so I mean, we could be here all day talking about pharma.
Okay.
The reality is they do spend a lot of money in developing the medications, and they still do cost a lot of money. This country does not allow generic medications for the most part. It allows that in other places like the global south. We can ask Gilead and other pharmaceuticals to step up to make their drugs a little cheaper, for example. But the reality is, it costs so much to make enough for everybody to have. And they cannot be completely free. We know that, right? We understand that. But we do. In this time, we will have to be asking pharmaceuticals to either step it up for something, something has got to give to where these drugs can be more accessible. The only way they have been accessible is through these safety net programs. And so I don't know if the pharmaceuticals are not getting enough money to reproduce the drugs, if we can have enough for everybody. At the same time, we know that the drugs have been too expensive, and there is a campaign to try and lower drugs, and so on and so forth. But I just feel like everything cannot happen at one time. We do need to lobby, we do need to ask the pharmaceuticals to make drugs more accessible. On the other hand, we know that our quality of life just doesn't depend on just the drug itself, right? We're facing mental health issues. We're facing comorbidities because of the drugs that we take, and because the virus still exists somewhere in our body, even if we're undetectable, we have inflammation. So we have all these other issues that we have to deal with. And that's why, Medicaid is really important, because it's not just covering your HIV, right? You're seeing your doctor, you're seeing your dentist, and you're taking care of all these other issues that come along, especially as you age with HIV.
Okay. Okay, I have a question here that I feel is really important. Okay, now if these draconian cuts are made, how prepared are the states to pick up the slack?
I mean, Kelly can add to this. This is a lot of money that we're talking about. And that's
Yeah.
why we know there will be an impact. It will not be possible for the state to make up billions of dollars and match it. Whatever little that they have, they will have to make it spread. And that's why they will have to make it harder. Whereas they could give more people, they will make the eligibility, like we've been talking about, so much harder, so that maybe they're, like we were saying, I think somebody said it in the chat, you gotta be really sick in order to get. I mean, they will fund your hospice care for you to die in dignity, but they're not gonna give you care before that. This is how it used to be, right? Before the ACA, before the Affordable Care Act. So it will be very, very hard for states to make up. It is almost impossible, which is why we're here and we're fighting. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And quite honestly, our federal government is obligated. This is a human right. So we can't just, I think Chauncey said it at the beginning, we shouldn't even consider it. We shouldn't give up. Our narrative should be, it is the obligation of the federal government to create that safety net for people who are vulnerable, especially they're vulnerable from some of the systematic oppression that they continue to have in this country. Kelly, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that's exactly right. The only small thing I would add on top of that is that as the states are not prepared, nor is the Ryan White program prepared, right?
Yeah.
As folks are losing access to health insurance, more people are going to have to rely on both state programs to try to fill in that gap, to try to make sure that they're able to continue to maintain the healthcare coverage they had before. And there's going to be more there's going to be more need for the Ryan White program, for the ADAP program, and both of those are already insufficient to meet need.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's just like that there's like, it's like throwing a pebble into a pond. There's going to be ripple effects that impact all of the different healthcare systems that exist in the US, because we don't have one healthcare system. We have many fragmented healthcare systems, oftentimes that don't talk to each other and have lots of holes.
Mhm. Ryan White was their pair of last resort. So you only got that if all these other systems had actually failed. And so it will absolutely be overwhelmed and would not be able to survive.
Excellent, excellent. I know some states they have not expanded Medicaid, so they might not be like Alabama. We might not be as impacted, but it's still going to hurt with some of the money that's coming in through the Medicaid system.
Yes. No, I mean, even without Medicaid expansion, the bare minimum, and this is why, earlier on we're saying today, in fact, one of the things that has come down for red states like Alabama that are worried, they're still worried that this will impact. They're trying to put together a fund. I think the last amount I heard was like $15 billion for rural hospitals. Well, even without expansion of Medicaid, those rural hospitals and providers almost, I can't remember what the percentage is, but is over 75% rely on Medicaid to support their people. They're going to close. They're literally saying even the basic hospitals in places like rural Alabama and Louisiana will shut down with just the traditional Medicaid if it's not there, if it's not funded. So it's not that it would be impacted a little, it will actually even be more so impacted because that was the only safety net that was there for some of those rural hospitals. And they're saying that they're going to shut down.
Okay. Well, we really want to thank you guys uh, for everything that you have shared with us today. It's been most informative. I think that we're almost at time. We just have a few more moments. And we would like you to, because there's such a heaviness right now, there's so much going on, and people are worried, people are afraid. Is there something that you guys could, uh, that you two could leave us with to maybe inspire us or give us a sense of
Absolutely.
hope? Yeah.
I'll let Chauncey go. He had some inspiring words, and then I'll hop on.
Yeah, I'll just say, can you hear me? Am I coming through?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll just say we are descendants from people who were never supposed to be here. Uh, we have been we've been tried and tested, and we've survived to this point. And we should refuse to accept anyone else's will as a challenge to our destiny and fate. And with community and as we take care of ourselves, we have to resolve that we can't take no for an answer. And whatever that means, whatever extent we have to go, we have to be willing to go to that point.
Right.
I am encouraged in this moment because the attacks have been so universal that it's everyone. There is no one exempt from any of these changes or cuts or threats. We're all impacted. And if we are who we say we are, including our country, we have to be able to survive this. There isn't a choice.
There isn't a choice. Yeah. And I think, Chauncey, you said something earlier that I'm going to hold on to is that we are actually winning. It doesn't look like it, but let's hold on to the win of organizing, of people have come together and in ways that we haven't seen before. My emails are so full in the morning, people sharing information, people, banding together, people understanding that we need to fight. And I think we need to count that as a win. People have never been more aware of the political system, of what is functioning and what is not functioning, of the fact that we're about to lose. People are just so aware and are asking. People have been asking on this call, what are we supposed to do? What can we do? And I think for me, that in itself is a win, that we're here, we're aware, and we're ready to get informed, advocate, and fight. So I'm going to count that as a win. I'm seeing we must hold on to our joy in the chat. I agree with that. And as Chauncey said, where we're coming from, songs of resilience, songs of joy that got us through. I really believe we can get through. We've got no choice. Like we are going to see on the other side. We know that there's only one term for this person. And I think the way people are riled up is that we might make this one term even for the party, because they're changing things that are impacting everybody, even the people that voted.
Mhm. That's true. That's true.
We're winning. We win in the end.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, like I said, we're just about at time. Kelly, do you have anything?
I will just say,
Oh, first.
call to
Oh,
action wise,
yeah.
I'm going to drop a bunch of links into the chat, and these are, like Martha just said, there's things coming through from all different angles. I'm going to put in a link for how you can call your senators and House reps, how you can organize at home. So we talked about how right now there's a deliberate decision, right? Funding war, funding militarism, funding immigration detention, funding tax cuts for billionaires over Medicaid, SNAP, essentials that we need to survive. So organize a Fund Medicaid Not War rally. Stay safe while you are organizing. There's a lane for everyone. So this is some safety tips that I'm about to drop in. Build and block. There was someone who was on the call named Shan, and this is a resource that I got from Shannon, who shared, and really it's an invitation to think about what kind of strategic approach you're most inspired to put forward and you're best suited to put forward. There's a space in this movement for everyone. And then finally, organize for community defense. So we know that immigrant communities, and particularly undocumented folks, are under really severe attack right now. And we can stand up for the folks in our communities in ways that keep all of us safe. So I dropped in a toolkit to give you some resources
Yes.
for that. And with that, Myra, I'll pass it to you to just introduce our next webinar.
Yes. We're going to have another very exciting webinar, and it's entitled What the Hellscape? Understanding Federal Policy and Advocacy in This Moment. And it's going to be held July the 24th, 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Mountains, and 3 p.m. Pacific. So just sign up for our webinars, and we will be so glad to have you. And I guess that's it for now.
Thank you, Myra. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Chauncey. Bye, everyone.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you so much.
So much.